Welcome to the tonight's shiur. Motzei Shabbos, Vayekhel Pikkudei, Parshas Chazan. It's also has been pointed out to me. It's the first yahrzeit of Rov of Anash. Should be a mele tzoshev for his family. Gashmis Beruchnis. I'm actually now in Bournemouth for Shabbos, and I want to share with you a halachic practice I'm still very excited about, and that is that this past week, there was a conference of Rabbonim in Vienna. The theme of the conference was about how to strategies to about intermarriage and how to diminish this terrible tragedy of intermarriage in the Jewish community. And I was asked to be one of the main speakers, halacha things, really very much to share with a lot of the kind of stuff which we've discussed here at the shiur and over the last few years. And so, all right, so I was slated to give 2 or 3 shiurim, and on Monday evening I go to the airport in Gatwick, and I'm traveling very light, so I don't have to do any check-in. And I come to just before the flight, which is when I was there, and typically delayed again and again. And just about half an hour before the flight, people are going over to the flight to board. And there's 2 lines. There's the non-priority and the priority. I did not pay extra for priority, but the priority line was quiet. So she calls me over, looks at my passport and says, "I'm sorry, your passport has less than 3 months validity, and we can't let you onto the plane." So I start saying, I've got to a conference and presenting. Calls her manager, no chance. Okay, I call up Herr Vogel, ask him perhaps he's got a bit of pull. I call up the organizers in Vienna, perhaps they can pull something off. No chance. Okay, the line's getting very, very thin, and something got into my head. I walked over to the non-priority desk, showed my passport, and she says, "Oh, you're almost expired. You can go on the plane." So I walk onto the plane, and I'm tittering because I'm worried that any minute they're going to say, "That tall guy with a black hat, he's gone through without permission, and we're going to get into trouble for letting him onto the plane." Kitzer got onto the plane, and then on the plane I called up the organizer, asked him to write a pigeon to the Rebbe that I shouldn't get into trouble at the other end when I get to Vienna to immigration. And the plane was delayed again. And so I'm sitting on the plane, and I wrote also a pigeon to the Rebbe, and I also made an online donation as a Demei Pidyon. A pidyon means you have to give money for stock also. So I did that all on the plane. And then towards the end of the flight, I'm saying Tilim. And then as I'm mamish on the line of the passport, I'm saying Oz Yoshir once and twice. And then I walk through to present my passport, looks at it, turn the page, gives me a stamp and lets me in. But it was really quite a traumatic experience, and I was very excited that they wished to help, that I should be able to get through. It was like a little bit l'mayla b'derech hateva. It was schus to be able to present by this kinutz, and there was a schus harabim to be able to present at the kinutz, which allowed me to go through. Okay, now let's see what's going on here. Something wrong with the presentation. Let's see. There we are. Okay. So, as I was saying, the other thing which I want to share with you, that was just like a little preamble. It's Motzei Shabbos, Chassidus Shemaisa. So, as I said, the theme of the keynote was about intermarriage, and we heard some very, very worrying statistics of the rates of intermarriage. And on Wednesday morning, so I was meant to be speaking about halachas, which are spin-offs of a case of intermarriage, but it came through my mind an interesting halacha, which I want to share with you. The story is, if a kohen had Rahman litzlan an accident and his finger got cut off. So there's a kind of surgery, which this can be sewn back together, and to a degree it can be saved. Shaila is like this: that a severed limb has got a tumor of Eiver min hachai. If a limb is severed from a living person, so then now it's so interesting because it went through my mind. I remember this Rashi in Nazir, and in the Daf Hayomi just last week. This was the Daf of the they learned this Daf Memhei in Nazir, and so there's a whole discussion about Eiver min hachai, and there's a din about a kohen is allowed to, if wife passed away, he's allowed to be metame to his wife, etc. But if it's to an organ, so he wouldn't be allowed to, because that's this discussion about eine metame le'evoreho. So coming back to Reb Shlomo Zalman was asked if a kohen is allowed to have this surgery, because after all, the severed limb is tomei, and by him having the operation, so he's touching the severed limb. And Reb Shlomo Zalman comes up with a brilliant answer, and he says, in Hilchos Shabbos, the Shin Chav Ches talks about the circumstances which you're allowed to do various things to save a life and to save from illness, and there's a level called sakonas ever. If there's a danger of a loss of a limb, someone is allowed to violate an Isur Rabbanon. That's the halacha in Shin Chav Ches. So he says nowadays koyanim are tomei in any case, because they've come into contact at some stage. So most koyanim are tomei in any case. So a kohen is tomei in any case to make himself more tomei. According to many Rishonim, is Isur Rabbanon. If he were Torah to make himself tomei, is Isur min Torah. Even today, nothing to do whether he's doing avodah, not doing avodah. A kohen mustn't make himself tomei mace. But if he's already tomei, to make himself tomei again, so the Rishonim says it's not awesome haTorah, it's only Rabbanon. Okay, so therefore, making yourself tomei to a limb is Isur Rabbanon. To save a limb, you're allowed to violate Isur Rabbanon. So Shlomo Zalman says he's allowed to have the surgery to connect his limb back. That's Reb Shlomo Zalman. So years ago, I learned this Rashi in Nazir, and I saw what we can find a different solution to this question. So let's read the Rashi inside. The husband may not be metame to the limbs which would have been severed. If an organ had been separated from her, whether she's alive or not, the husband may not make himself tomei to the organ. That although there is a dispensation for a kohen to be tomei, make himself tomei to immediate relative, that's only to the overall body, but not to an organ. Because that limb has been detached and cannot be restored. That's the Rashi here. So I'm taking from this Rashi the following: that when an organ is severed and cannot be restored, it's got a tumah b'eiver min hachai. But if it can be restored, it doesn't have the tumah. Therefore, when you're talking about coming back to our topic about the intermarriage, etc., and people talk about being detached from Yiddishkeit and like a severed limb, But the truth is, we see that with due engagement, one is able to revive these people, bring them back to Yiddishkeit. Therefore, don't call them detached, don't call them Tommy. On the contrary, because they through appropriate approaches to contact, they can be brought back to Yiddishkeit. Therefore, they remain a part of Klal Yisrael, and it's our privilege to be able to bring them back. Just if I may say, also a word of the Baal Shem Tov, I may have said this before. The conference was on Yom Chov Beis. That's a Tilim in Yom Chov Beis, capital Rov of Anash. So Baal Shem Tov says the following: there are those souls who come down to this world, which literally means a boat, a ship, but also the word oniya means with grief. Ta'aniyo va'aniyo. There are those neshamas which come down to this world and they have no support system, neither their parents nor their surroundings. They are like a boat on the high seas with no safety at all. So these are the Yoda Hayom va'aniyos. Oisei meloch b'mayim rabim. Those who do labor in the great waters is the lifeboat crew. Those who have the privilege to go out into these raging seas and to be able to salvage these neshamas and bring them back to safety. And that I said to the Rabbonim at this Kinus, that's the privilege of the Rabbonim in these small communities, particularly. But whoever is, that's anyone who's there in the front line is one of those to help bring Yidden back. Okay, so that was a halacha agoda combination. Okay, let's go on to some dry halacha. And so now we have a question. Someone wrote to me that, we're about to be very particular. With particular on Pesach, for even the tiniest speck of chometz, and is mentioned in the Bar Heitev in Hilchos Pesach, that if b'shem ha'arizal, that if one succeeds to avoid ingesting even the tiniest speck of chometz during the year, one is protected not to commit sin during the year. We still have b'chir chafshis, it's okay, but it's a protection. That's the explanation for the extreme hidurim, which are familiar certainly in Chassidish circles, not only in Chabad, in many Chassidish circles, extreme hidurim for Pesach. So, all right, so one of the things is about not using manufactured goods as much as possible, which I want to say, it's not I think I said this before, it's not a perfect science. I will use Kedem wine, but I won't use Kedem apple juice. It's possibly even the same factory, but I can manage without apple juice, so I don't have apple juice. I have a homemade. I'm not capable of making my own wine, so therefore the wine I buy matzahs also, by the way. I don't make my own matzahs, so the things which I can make on my own. Actually, I'm not being honest. It's my wife who makes them. The things which you can make at home, so we make at home. All right. So this fellow doesn't want to buy coffee from a manufacturer. He wants to make his own coffee. Fine, I respect that. But there's equipment. Don't ask me more details. The equipment for roasting and for grinding. So someone said an idea: buy the stuff, buy the equipment online, whatever, and then after Pesach you'll return it and say, yeah, I don't need it. It didn't work properly. Whatever, you can give it back. You can nowadays it's you can. I don't know whether it's changed a bit, but there is this idea that you can give back goods which you're not happy with. So is that legitimate? Is that legitimate to buy a piece of equipment with every intention of giving it back and getting a refund after your Pesach? So here we have a halacha in Hilchos Oinoah, in the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch in Chesed Mishpat. There's a din of Oinoah, which means harassment. You're not allowed to harass another Yid. And it talks here about Oinoah's devorim. And then we have here in Sif Chof Ches, V'chein lo yoyma lechaveiroi. One should not approach his colleague, his fellow, to say, how much, this car, how much would you accept for the car, for sale? And you have no intention of buying it. Or you don't have the money. He's just pulling the guy's leg. He's just having some. He's building up the fellow's hopes, and then when he transpires he doesn't buy the article, so then the other fellow will recognize that you are just having some enjoyment at his expense, and he will feel oppressed. So this is a form of harassment, to offer, to start engaging that you want to buy something, and then you don't buy. It's a form of harassment. Now, arguably, with the online purchase, there's no human being who's being harassed. There are people on the one end, there are people on the other end. No one's going to lose any sleep about this. But I think actually it's worse than this. No normal supplier will sell you a piece of equipment knowing that you have no intention to keep it. It costs them, there are overheads. It costs them money to process your order and process the return. All of that costs money, and you are using them without them profiting from this transaction. So I see it as gneva rather than as harassment, but I see it as gneva, as using something which there's no way they would have agreed to it, unless there is a possibility in your own mind that if you do like it, you will keep it. Then okay. Then that's legitimate. And so you're taking on approval, that's legitimate. But if it's clearly you have no intention of keeping it, you intend to give it back afterwards, I think it's simply dishonest. Someone's pointing out there's another aspect here. Well, you know what, you're buying this piece of equipment. You never know, perhaps there was another chacham earlier on who bought this equipment and sent it back and tried it out with some comments. I guess that you'd recognize on the packaging whether it was ever opened before, and if it was, yes, it may have been used with Dvarim Asurim. Let's move on. So here, someone asked me last Friday night, for some reason his toddler's Yarmulke was left in Shul, and he wants to know whether he can put a Yarmulke under his Yarmulke and walk home, bringing home his toddler's Yarmulke to the house. So here we have, this is from Siman Shein Aleph, which talks all about carrying on Shabbos and wearing, what's called carrying. It's come up some of these things recently. When we talked about the tracker, if you remember, that came up in this Siman. And so it says here about a woman should not be wearing a garment to protect her tichel. She's got a nice tichel, and she doesn't want to get spoiled by the rain, to wear a garment to protect a garment. That would not be okay. If she's wearing it to protect herself, then that is okay. Then we have about wear a hat on top of a hat. So you are allowed to wear a hat on top of a hat to protect from rain, because that's a derech malbush, provided that one is deeper than the other. So that's very common, that we are accustomed to wear a yarmulke and then we wear a hat on top of it, and we walk in the street wearing both, one on top of the other. But the key words here are derech malbush, because that's a normal behavior, normal way of dressing. So in the Piskei Teshuvos, on the same Siman as Shein Aleph, he talks about this, and I'm just quoting these couple of lines. The word couple was not a pun intended. Avol loleches b'shnei kippos. to, why it's not shnei, not shtei, to wear two kippos, or shnei koivaim, or two hats, one on top of the other. That would not be okay. Kevon she'ein haregilus bekach, since it's not a normal behavior, also hadov, that would not be okay. And so actually, this is like what I told the Yaman, he shouldn't do that. He can take off his own yarmulke and leave it in Shul and wear his toddler's yarmulke home. That would be possibly okay. Right. Now, in the notes of the Piskei Teshuvos, he mentions that his own father, Biala Rebbe, wears two yarmulkes. And I heard from Reb Aaron Tiferbrun, his father-in-law, the late Shalomber Eichhorn, was a meshamish. He was an attendant of the Frierdiker Rebbe. He was a kohen, but the Rebbe never called him by his first name. He called him Eichhorn. He didn't want to call him Shalom Ber because that was the name of his father, the Rebbe Rashab. Called upon him when it came Yud Shvat, Tov Shin Yud, at the Torah, when the Rebbe passed away, so they saw that the Rebbe was always wearing two yarmulkes. So there isn't an Indian. Coming back, the Piskei Teshuvos says those who normally wear two yarmulkes, they could wear two yarmulkes on Shabbos also, because that's their derech levisha. If that's the normal thing. Here we're talking about wearing a second yarmulke for transportation, not for your wearing. What's the reason of wearing two yarmulkes? So there's a ha'orah. Well known, this idea of shtei makifim. And there's a ha'orah somewhere in the Mamorim of the Frierdiker Rebbe about the wearing two makifim, to wearing two layers of covering. I don't remember the details of the Maimer. I do know it's the idea of shtei makifim. You have makif hakorov, makif harochik. I don't remember the Kabbalistic explanation, but there is an idea, as we know, Chassidim generally do make a point, especially for davening, but even for a bracha, to have a hat and a yarmulke. And so by having two yarmulkes, that's also an alternative to being careful about shtei makifim. I mentioned before, it's Reb Levi Paris's Yortzeit. If I'm not mistaken, he would very often be wearing a tissue underneath his yarmulke for this idea of having shtei makifim. Someone's pointing out here a rain hat for a woman to protect her sheitel. So if it's just to protect the sheitel, that would be a problem. But the advice given is to have the rain hat extending over the forehead and over the neck in a way that it's protecting not only the sheitel, but it's also protecting the body, and therefore it's not a problem. Let's move on to our next question. That's question 4, and that is about a lady who's pregnant, and because of this, she's finding drinking grape juice an ordeal, which she's not looking forward to, having to have 4 cups of grape juice. So the question is, how much of an ordeal does one have to endure to be able to fulfill the mitzvah of Arba Kos? So there's a famous lashon here where you have this is the first quote is from Tov Ayin Beis, second quote is Tov Ayin Gimel. So here we have that a person's Chof Aleph in Tov Ayin Beis, that a person doesn't drink wine throughout the year because they can't stand the stuff or because it's harmful to them. Nevertheless, they should push themselves to drink 4 cups of wine the night of Pesach. We have the story of Rabbi Yehuda bar Rabbi Eloi, who would drink 4 cups of wine on Pesach, and then he had to gird his tzedor, means his something about his what's it called, the side of the mouth, whatever. He endured suffering for the next couple of months till Shavuos. And then we have, that's in Siman Tov Ayin Beis. In Siman Tov Ayin Gimel, it's talking about morer. And you can see here at the end of Sif Lamed Aleph, it talks about a person who cannot have morer. So it says about having just a few nibbles, just lezecher. Then he says, Avol chayiv odem lidchekes atzma. A person should push themselves, the kaim mitzvahs chachamim, to fulfill the mitzvah. Thank you. The word for tzedom is temples, okay? But one should push oneself to fulfill the mitzvahs chachamim, to eat a full kazayis of morer, even though it's going to be painful. And what the shiur of kazai is for morer is discussed later in Tov Pevav. Okay, so we do have here that a person should be ready to endure some degree of suffering in order to do the mitzvahs. So, on the other hand, there can be beyond how much they can handle. And then, what I would say, what my response to this request was, first of all, try to get a small cup. So you can get a cup of whatever, 100 gram or 100 milliliters or even smaller, go down to 75 if necessary. I know Reb Chaim Noah talks about 86, but there are more recent poskim who have reduced the size of the revius to 75 milliliters, and that's based upon current, more up-to-date research about the dirham, which is mentioned in the Rambam, and which, in other words, which were the items which the Rambam was using, which coinage was the Rambam referring to, and more recent discoveries have indicated that it's actually smaller than it was believed until now, and therefore they've reduced. So first of all, to have a smaller cup. Second thing is to have to look for a grape juice which is not so sweet. I'm sure there are different types, so one can do a bit of research and find a less sweet one. Thirdly, when you drink, you don't have to drink the whole cup. Rov kois, majority of the cup, so you're actually majority of a revius, that's enough. But the main thing which I wanted to share was that I would suggest that after having heard her grape juice for each of the cups, she then drinks a glass of water. And hopefully the glass of water will serve to dilute the taste of the grape juice, both in her mouth and in her body, and that way protect her from the enduring undue pain. Let's move on to the next question. And here is a story that someone wrote to me earlier in the week. Yeah, someone's asking, can you dilute the grape juice? I'm not so sure how much you can dilute grape juice. There is, with wine, in the Gemara's times, they were allowed to dilute, I think it was 5 parts of water to 1 part of wine. It was still considered wine, still kept the taste. Question is, how much can you dilute grape juice and it's still called wine? See, grape juice doesn't have any alcohol practically, and therefore, is it still called grape juice once it's diluted? I'm not sure about that. That's why I didn't suggest that. But I think physically, whether the water is added in the cup or added afterwards by drinking a glass of water afterwards, I think biologically it'll have the same effect. So I prefer to go that way rather than diluting the actual grape juice. Not because I think they add water to the grape juice. As far as I know, it's not. That's not the case. But it says 100% grape juice. It means there's no water added. But I'm just worried whether it'll lose the status of a wine by adding water. And I don't know how to guide on that. Okay, so here someone is asking about in a particular Chabad house. So there's a visitor or a local who has a yard site or something, and he came a little bit late, and so he didn't manage to take the omid for Chazoras haShatz, for the first part of davening, but he asked to switch over. He should do Ashri of Lציon and say the Kadish after Ashri of Lציon. So the Shliach was brought up in Crown Heights. I'd never heard of such a thing, switching over by Lציon. Then he's all concerned, and then he sent me a whole parsha, a whole thing from a particular Rov, which didn't have the name attached, who's saying that the Kadish teskabel so means that the prayer should be accepted. Who said that prayer refers to Chazoras haShatz? And therefore it should be the Chazan who said Chazoras haShatz. He should be the one who should say teskabel so, therefore it's inappropriate to switch over. No. So first of all, but the minig ha'olam is actually clearly that it is done. Now, for the lower quote is from Nitei Gavriel. The earlier quote is from the Mishnah Brura in Bir Halacha in Siman Kuf Lamed Beis. Siman Kuf Lamed Beis is just at the end of davening. And there he talks about the extra kadeshim, etc. And then there's a whole very long entry in the Bir Halacha about how to negotiate when you have several chiyuvim to say Kadish. Who do you give Kadish? The one who's a local, and the one who's a visitor, and the one who's a shloshim, and the one who's a yortzeit. It's the whole hierarchy there. But there he says, then that's all more about Kadish, because nowadays it's hardly relevant, because in most communities it's accepted that several people say Kadish at the same time, and therefore there's no competition who's going to say Kadish. But there's still competition of who's going to be the Chazan. Yeah, if a person's capable to be a Chazan, it's a privilege to be a Chazan when he's in the year of Avelis. So here we have in the Mishnah Brura Bir Halacha, he says the following: if both candidates are able to lead the davening, now this is a very important point, that the Omid does not belong to the Oval. The Omid belongs to the congregation. And for someone to push himself to take the Omid, contrary to the wishes of the Kohol, it's not acceptable. On the other hand, sometimes the Kohol are going to just swallow. They're not going to make a fuss. But it's really, one should be asking permission from the Kohol before taking over the Omid. So you've got here two people, both capable and both acceptable, and so you got two candidates. Yatilu beinehem goyrel ba'ofen zeh, cast a lot. She'echad yispalel ad Ashrei uva Lציון. One of them should be Chazan until Ashrei uva Lציון. V'hasheni yispalel Ashrei uva Lציון, and the other one will take over Ashrei uva Lציon. So this is already. And I'm sure the Mishnah Brura did not invent this themselves. This is something which is probably going back hundreds of years, that this was the resolution when you had two candidates for being Chazan. So one would be for the first part of davening, and the second one would take over by Ashrei uva Lציon. You're going to ask, Tittkabel. What about Tittkabel? So the answer is, my simple answer is the following. The Chazan, as I said, it's not his private business. The Chazan is there to represent the Kohol. And therefore, when he says Tittkabel tzloisoin, when he was the Chazan, it wasn't even his own davening, it was the davening of the Kohol. And therefore, when he says Tittkabel tzloisoin, the prayer of the Kehillah. So if someone else takes over and he says Tittkabel tzloisoin, so what? What's the difference? They're talking about the communal. In addition, I'm asking the question. At Ma'ariv, we don't have Chazoras haShatz, and we say Tittkabel tzloisoin. So what's that talking about? It's obviously talking about the quiet Shemoneh Esrei. And therefore, I don't see a cause for concern about this. As I say, the minig ha'olam is definitely that switch over by Ashrei uva Lציon is acceptable. Why did he not see this in Chabad? Because in Chabad it's much more, in the separate chiyuvim, there's much more a tendency to start mustering separate minyanim. You can complain about it, but I'm just telling you that's the fact. He's brought up in Crown Heights, so he's never seen this idea of switching over, because, as I said, people would just manage to put together another minyan. But in places where that's not an option, so the switch over is apparently quite a common solution. Right. Let's move on. Someone's saying that the kedem do add water. That may be, but I'm talking about grape juice, which, as far as I know, is I've seen this in various publications, that grape juice does not have added water, especially like the French grape juice. It says on it 100% pure, and that is to vouch for that there's no water added. Okay. Let's move on to the next question. That's question number 6. A man, for some reason, it wasn't because of illness, it was something else, and And he added a name. So now he asks me, does he have to now update his wife's Kesubah? Of course, he said, can I update my Kesubah? It's not his Kesubah, it's his wife's Kesubah, yeah? You have to update it. And actually, this is not such a rare situation. I'm not beyond that, of course, in the case of a choili, occasionally, we add a shame, and if he, Baruch Hashem, as Hashem recovers, so then that is going to be relevant. But let's say now, it's quite a common thing in Lubavitch. People who have several daughters, and their name is Menachem Mendel, and they find it looking for shidduchim. And every second candidate invited Menachem Mendel. So now there's a meister. You don't have a son-in-law and a father-in-law with the same name. So I know of a couple of prominent Lubavitch Chassidim, Rabbonim, Mashpiyim, who added another name, whether it's Meir Menachem Mendel or Moshe Menachem Mendel, they added another name. This is going to become the question. Do they have to now make an adjustment to the Kesubah? So this is what you have in front of you. I'm sure we've addressed this in the past, but it's come up again. And so I was short of how much material I have for this week's shiur. So, okay, so I'm sharing with you again. Some people weren't here last time. Okay, so this is from the Sefer Mishpat HaKesubah. This is written by Rebbe Yoel Bar Shalom. I've met him a few times, son-in-law of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, and it's a specialist series on Kesubahs. And so one of the things he writes here, if a man or a woman added a name after marriage, so there's different opinions. Some say you'd have to write a new Kesubah. Others say it's not necessary because the Kesubah is testifying of the events as they were at the time of marriage, and that was true. That was his name at the time of marriage. He concludes the following: if sometimes the added name doesn't seem to click, then don't worry about it altogether. If the new name is now appended with the old name, so then you write at the bottom of the Kesubah, you'll have an addendum that the husband, declared in the presence of two witnesses, he said that he now has an added name, or her name has been added, and henceforth is going to be known as such and such, and the witnesses will date and sign that addendum, and that's what should be done. That's the second thing. And what happens if, now there's two ways. There's a way of adding a name, and there's a way of switching names. If the old name has been dropped and now is known under a new name, so then indeed they should change the Kesubah, because now the old Kesubah will be unenforceable because no one knows him with this name. I've mentioned this before. The word shtar comes from the lashon of shoiter, which means like a policeman, enforceable. It's imperative to a shtar, to a document, that it should be enforceable. And if it's not known with that name, then that actually does call into question the validity of the Kesubah. We go on to the next question, and that was about a wedding. And at the wedding, the chosin places the ring on the finger of the kala. What happens if the chosin and or kala are left-handed? Do they do these motions with their left hand? So, interesting. Well, first of all, let's just go for a moment. Why does the chosin give a kala a ring rather than anything else? So one of the explanations for this is that generally the assets of a married woman will belong to the husband. So what's the point of him giving her anything when it becomes hers? But because it says his rather. If he gives her something which is mamash, a personal item, then that's totally hers. So he gives her a ring, which is a personal item rather than just something valuable or a piece of equipment. Therefore, that's why a ring is given. So now we have here, this what I have in front of you is from, there's a whole volume called Dine Iter, which is all about lefties. When do lefties get treated like everyone else, or when are they given special switchover treatment? So he writes, if the Chazan is a lefty, he should give the ring with his left hand. If the Kala is a lefty, she should accept the finger, the ring on the finger of her left hand. And then he quotes here the Sefer Nachlas Shiva. He says, the Nachlas Shiva is one of the primary sources for in matters of chasana. He really, particularly, he's more into documents. He's got a very detailed explanation of the Kesubah, step by mamish, line by word for word, explaining why this word is spelled this way and why the phrase is used this way. So that's the Nachlas Shiva. But he has here also a comment about why the ring is put on the finger. Why don't you just give? So he says like this. Normally, it's common, and when a person wants to point, they will use their index finger. And therefore, that's the most prominent kind of, if you want to say, protrusion from the body, which is going to draw someone's eye, is a finger, a pointing finger. And therefore, that's why the ring of Kiddushin is going to be placed on the index finger more than other fingers, and on the right one, which is going to be more active when it comes to touching and pointing, etc. And therefore, he says, if the woman will wear this wedding ring on her hand and on this finger, people will see that she is a married woman, and they'll know that she is a mekudeshes, and they will not be bothering her to offer her shidduch, etc. Okay, we're not going to the practicalities of whether it's going to deter or whether she wants to be deterred. That's a side issue. But meanwhile, there is this idea of having the ring on the index finger being the most prominent area where it would be placed, and therefore it follows. This Sefer Din Iter says, therefore, it makes sense that the lefty, a woman who's a lefty, would have the ring put on her left hand, the finger on her left hand, because that's the hand which is going to be more active and therefore more noticeable. Therefore, it should be done. The ring should be put on the left hand. Mr. Kora is pointing out that many times, the name Chaim is added when someone is very ill. Do you put this on the matzeva? So the answer to that is, if the person recovered from the illness, this is written in the Shulchan Aruch and Panorama, if the person recovered from that illness, then that name remains as their name. If they sadly did not recover, then it's not included for posterity. Let's move on. So here someone's asking about a name, Michael, something Michael, Gavriel, actually Yisrael. How do we deal with, these are names with Hashem's name in them. So do they have a Kedusha, and both in speech and in script? So we know that there are 7 names of Hashem, which if they are written, we mustn't erase them. Vovke, Adni, Elikim, Kale, Shin Dalad Yud, Tzvois. I think I said 5. Okay, Shulchan Aruch has a list, Yudke. And what happens if a sofer made a mistake, let's say missed out a word, and put Hashem's name there, one of these 7 names, and in order to get the text right, he's going to have to erase it. He can't erase that, and that's going to be, it may be necessary to cut off a whole section of the sefer and put it into Shemus, because you can't erase Hashem's name, even if it's for the purpose of repairing and completing the text. So what about, as if it would be somewhere in the text, a name Eliezer, which Eliezer means Hashem, Keli, my God, Ezer is a helper, and so on. You've got so many of these names which have got which is clearly, I've got a Hashem's name incorporated. And what would happen if the name Eliezer was written and the Sofer has need to erase it because missed out a word? Is he allowed to erase such a word? So this is just in other words, a personal name, a human name, which incorporates God's name. Does it have a kedusha? So what I remember reading this clearly. That's not a problem. I spent some time on Friday and even what's a Shabbos trying to find it. I think we've discussed this in earlier shiurim, but I couldn't find it on my index either. May have been a bit earlier, maybe more than 2 years ago. Meanwhile, this is from a sefer called Tashbitz. I mentioned before, there's 2 Tashbitz, and this is Sheshes Bar Tzodok, and he writes in Siman Kufay and Zion that you have human names. Suri Shadoi was one of the Meraglim, I think. Was it one of the Nesiim? That the father was called Suri Shadoi, Emmanuel, which means God is with us, Elio, etc. Of course, they are referring to Hashem, but they are human names. They do not have Kedusha. Actually, as I was researching, I came along with the name Odelia. And Odelia, apparently, I don't know whether it exists in English, but Odelia means, Ode, I will thank, Le Yudke, to Hashem. So I can understand parents are excited, very grateful to Hashem that they have a new baby, and they gave the name Odelia, but it's a human name, therefore it would not have Kedusha. He gives a reference to the Gemara Psochim, where it talks about the name Yedidya, and it says that if Yedidya is written Yedid Yudke, then the Yudke will have the Kedusha. If it would be Yedidya's one name, as Shlomo HaMelech, one of his names was Yedidya. So then it would have, if it's one name, it would be, if it's not without a gap, then it would be, then it would not have Kedusha. And then you could, so another few examples, Amiel, Amishadoi, and Suriel, Surishadoi, Gamliel, Pedotsur, well, I don't see why he brings that in, probably for the Gamliel, Pedael. So all of these, the Yerushalmi says they shouldn't be divided, but then they are human names, and they do not have Kedusha. The Reb Ari is pointing out about the name Beis El. That's more of a complicated, more difficult, because there it's written as separate. It's separate. So therefore, Lemaisa, as far as I remember, it's still, you can say Beis El if you mean the name of the town, but that's going to be more complicated because the Aleph Lamed is written on its own. Now, just towards the end of Shabbos, I saw the following quote in the Sefer Tam HaMinhagim, which I'm going to read with you. He writes the following in the Sefer Divrei Shol. That's from Reb Shol Natanson. That's a commentary on Agodas Hashas. So I saw it inside, but he quotes from Rabbi Yisrael Mibroino that one should use the names about Eliyahu, just say Elia, Gedalia. Gedalia, and he says that it should be just use 2 letters of the Shem. I don't really understand what he's saying. Somehow to avoid using 3 letters of the Shem. I don't fully understand what he's saying, actually. What I could tell you is that in writing, we generally try to mitigate this by, let's say, the name Chaya. So we've gone through this recently, we're talking about the Kesubah, but in general writing, we'd write the name Chaya with a stroke. Eliyahu will usually write Aleph Lamed Yud with a stroke, and so on. Gedalia, generally we do avoid writing the Yud K in the name, or alternatively putting a dash. But it's not, certainly in the name Yisrael, it's not common for people to put a dash in. That's maybe a minority, but it's halachic, it's not necessary. The name Yehuda. So it's some people write the name Yehuda, they'll write Yud Vov Dalad Aleph, again to avoid, because it's got the letters of Yud Ke Vav Ke. But these are Lifnim Mishur Sadin, and Min Hadin, they do not have Kedusha. And so this is coming back and then pronouncing can you say refoil? People do say refoil, although, yes, people will say folia. And Eliezer, there's a tendency to say laser. There may be, this is Lifnim Moshe Sadin, so there may be, so looking at this name, Ariel, for example, perhaps you use the word, it's called Ari rather than Ariel. It's not a problem to say Ariel, but there may be a header to use just part of the name as that sensitivity to avoid saying Hashem's name when not warranted. This is a separate discussion about names of Malachim, that we don't pronounce names of angels, and that's the whole thing about people ask about the name of Yusuf Zvodya at the end of Hallel. But that's the reason that we don't want to, when we say a name of a Malach, we're summoning the Malach, and if we didn't mean it for prayer, then we can incur the upset of the Malach for being summoned for nothing. So that's about names of Malachim, apart from names of Malachim which are common human names, like Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, Kasriel. These names, because they are commonly used for people's names, that's not a problem. But if it's a Malach name, so let's say Matat, we don't say the full name of Matat, we'll say just Matat, and so on, we'll just say part of it. On the other side, like Samach Mem, we just say just Samach Mem rather than the full name, because we don't want to invoke a Malach by name without a proper justification for it. Right, you're saying that Ari is pointing out it can raise issues with Gittin. Okay, I'm going to recuse myself. That's the right word. I don't deal with Gittin, and so there's a rule that person any idea but Gittin and Kiddushin should not be engaging with that. I don't deal with Gittin. I sleep better with that approach. Okay, now a couple of more things left on the list, and that is number 9. Is there an issue about, now we know there's an issue about blocking a window or a doorway, and that's attributed to Rav Yehuda HaChassid. So someone's asking, what about a chimney? Now, this particular case which was asked to me was that they had moved into a house and already the chimney stack had been largely removed, but there's still the chimney itself had been blocked. So there is the inyan of this concern is that when there has been a passage from one room to the other, there was a window or one room to the other, to the outside. So then to block up that passage, so the ruchos which had used that passage, and now you're blocking their access, so they can be upset. And we know that we're particular about this. I mentioned this in the past, when at some stage in upstairs in 770, when they put up a wall between the small and the tiny shul. Yeah, so there's a small zal and there's the cheder sheni. And at a particular time they put up a separation between the two. There used to be windows, and the Rebbe was concerned about it and told Chaim Baruch Halberstam to make sure that there's a hole drilled through. So we are particular. But what about chimneys? Is a chimney the same as a window and a doorway? So there is a sefer called Kinyan Torah from the Rov of Strasbourg, who says it's not a problem. I did not manage to look up inside, but I did look up the sefer Shmiras Haguf Hanefesh. He specializes with all this kind of stuff, and he's not so excited with that heter. And actually, I think if that's the logic, that the ruchos have a access, so chimneys I don't think are any different. But in this case, it had been blocked already. To start having to unblock it, and was even done before, I don't feel it was a need to start, breaking through, especially if it was done before you moved in. I believe that there is a bit of a concern there. But, so one should leave, if it does come up, one should leave some kind of opening as a vent. Right. Finally, the last thing which we have on our list for this evening is about can you, in Chabad, for Pesach, we only use vegetables or fruit which can be peeled. Can you use unpeeled vegetables or fruit in cooking before Pesach? Now, on the one hand, the wine which I have, as I mentioned before, I use Kedem wine, and it's used with unpeeled. It's made with unpeeled grapes. Had the grapes been peeled, you wouldn't have red wine. So my wine is made with unpeeled grapes, and then it goes through a filtration, etc. And I'm not worried about it. Yeah. So my balance on this is, if you're going to make a food before Pesach, and it's going to be pureed in a way that there is no visible peel, so then we're going to go for bottle b'shishim, etc. before Pesach, and that's one of the advantage of cooking before Pesach is that you have the facility of bottle b'shishim. But let's say to take zucchini, or what we call in England, what we call again zucchini, we call whatever, cup. So frustrated. So to cut them up and to put them in a salad and put them into the freezer, then during Pesach you're taking it out, and you've got all the peels there, and it looks courgette. Thank you. So that I would say no. In other words, if it's not going to be visible, not going to be noticeable, then yes. If it is going to be visible, then don't even from before Pesach, I would say no. Is it perfect? As I said before, the Chumras of Pesach are not a perfect science, and just my own balance about this. I want to finish off, and I have a couple of minutes. I want to finish off about the sale of chametz, and as this conference in Vienna, I presented for the Rabbonim to be able to do their own mechias chametz, and I said to the Rabbonim, if you are able to do a Seder Kiddushin, you can also do a mechias chametz with you. If you prepare yourself properly, you learn how to do it. It's not such a difficult thing. And I'm concerned about. I receive the people, the chametz which is sold online, and the way it is set up is it's legal, it's kosher halacha, but actually if people put in too much information, then in the printout you can't see the information because they've put on too much and it doesn't come out in the printout. And I'm not chas v'sholom saying that, but there is definitely a value of doing mechias chametz in person, or speaking to the Rov and telling him where the chametz is, and may get some guidance whether this is a legitimate way of putting away chametz. If it's not, so people sometimes will come along and say they want to sell one shelf in the freezer, and they know that they know now, but that would not be okay, and so on. I think we discussed it in the past. So I'd like to encourage people to do mechias chametz in person, or if you can't make it in person, make a phone call, etc., rather than just doing it in a totally impersonal way. Of course, if you are embarrassed for whatever reason to make it in person, or you can't make it, so do it online, but it's second best. Finish off that and told the story how the Rebbe's and Chana, the Rebbe's mother, in her memoirs, she describes how her husband, Reb Levi, was before the mechias chametz was very tense. It's a great responsibility, but and then afterwards he was relaxed once he had sold the chametz. So it is a concern, it is a right of responsibility. Just to finish off with the Reb Mendel Futterfass story, Reb Mendel Futterfass told me that when he was in Siberia, there was a job in the gulag of taking the trees and putting through an electric saw to make them into planks. And this was a very dangerous job because at the slightest slip, sometimes there could be a jerk and the person holding the plank could be thrown to the ceiling. Sometimes they slip and they could cut their fingers off. And Stalin, in his kindness, had also sent surgeons to the gulag, so people would take their fingers and run back to camp, and the surgeon would sew them back. The kids, so people were not so excited with his job, but Mendel said he actually liked this job. The reason being, he said, the kunst is you take that log and hold it firm, and you run it through, and you hold it strong and firm, and nothing's going to happen. And what I said to the Rabbanim on Wednesday is the same thing with the Mechias Chometz. It is a responsibility. Prepare yourself properly, hold it firm, and you'll be able to run it through without any mishap. Wish you all a good Woche and a good Chodesh, and we should see the Chodesh HaGeula, Geula HaShlema, with Moshiach Tzidkenu, and Heir Yamamish, and Yo Hanovi, Zal Mavasa Zayin, Besuras HaGeula, take care of Miyad Mamish.
Amen.
Good.
Yes,
Good.
good.
Good.